So once you finish the attack step of the ship phase, it's then time to move on to the movement phase, or the movement step. I'm going to keep messing that up all day. And that is when you use your handy dandy movement tool here and plot your ship's course of movement. Now first you refer to your ship's speed dial, which is the dial that you set at the very beginning of the game when you deployed your ship. So here I have my Assault 2 or my Mark II frigate at speed 2, meaning that it can only go up to the second bracket here. So here's where we refer to our ship's card. And here in the bottom left corner you'll see their speed and movement capabilities. So what this picture means is that for each speed of the ship, it shows you how many times you can click the yaw on the movement dial, or on the movement tracker here. So I'm currently at speed 2. As you can see, the first square here has 1 tick and the second square here has 1 tick. If I were moving at speed 3, I would not be allowed to move the first vertex here at all. However, for the second vertex here, I'd be allowed to click it once in any direction, left or right. And then for the third square, I'd also be allowed to move it once. But I'm at speed 2. So at speed 2, it says that I'm allowed to click the first one, either left or right. And then at the second square, I'm also allowed to move that either left or right. So what I would do is then line up my ship and move it accordingly. Now it's at this time that you are allowed to spend movement tokens and navigation dials, which, remember, allows you to increase your speed. So if I were to spend this token, it would let me go up to speed 3 or down to speed 1, and then I would treat that as it shows here on the card. But if I were to spend the dial, it means that I'm allowed to, again, either increase or decrease my speed, but I'm also allowed to temporarily change my yaw value by 1 on any given vertex here. So that means if I were to increase my speed to 3, even though it says at the first step I'm not allowed to move here, if I were to spend the navigation dial, I could increase my yaw and then be allowed to click this once. Or I could instead, at any other point, be allowed to click it twice in any given direction, therefore giving me harder turns. So I will simply line up the pegs here on the ruler, put it up and flush against the plastic that also has notches for this ruler, and then be allowed to move up to the point marked on the speed that I'm going at. So at speed 2, I'm going to have to go to the pegs that are at speed 2. Now because I'm allowed to bend this in different ways, I could measure out which way I want to go. But let's say, for example, I wanted to do this. Now if I were to actually do this movement here, or let's just say, for example, this. If I were to try to do this movement, my ship would overlap the ruler, and that's not allowed. If I wanted to do a maneuver like this, I would have to either move my ruler to the other side here so that I would not overlap the ruler, or I'd have to change my movement entirely. But let's say I want to do this maneuver. I'm not overlapping the ruler, however I did just overlap one of my own ships, or one of my own squadrons, and have to move it out of the way. When that happens, it is then my opponent's decision where this squadron goes. However, it has to be touching the base of my ship. So this could be detrimental to your plans here if they move one of your squadrons out of position from where you wanted them to be. So they could decide, alright, I'm going to move them all the way back here, touching the base of your ship, and that's what it is. And that's how you resolve the movement step of the ship phase. And then you would go back and forth between you and your opponent, resolving ship activations. They would decide which ship they want to activate, reveal their dial, decide what they want to do, whether not to spend a token or resolve any effects from there, attack twice, and then do their movement. If I were to make a movement that, for example, would have me hit another ship. So for example, let's say I'm still going speed 2, and if I were to do my movement here, I would, of course, end hitting my opponent. Obviously that's not allowed, so if I were to do that kind of a movement, first off, I wouldn't be able to finish that movement at all. Instead, I would have to reduce my speed down by 1 and try to do a movement like that. Now that's a temporary speed change. You're not permanently changing your speed down by 1. So in this example, okay, I could finish a speed 1 movement and move like that. However, because I still am going at speed 2 technically, and because I did virtually ram you, we would both take 1 face down damage card. However, in subsequent turns, you could still be moving at speed 2. But let's say, however, let's say he moved like that, and now it's my turn to move again, and there's no way that I could possibly move. I have to reduce my speed all the way down to 0, be unable to move, at least for this turn, and we both take a face down damage again. And that's what happens if you try and ram another opponent. It might be a viable strategy, but probably not. There are also consequences if you land on top of an obstacle. Now remember, we place these obstacles on the field during the setup of the game, and each of these obstacles have different effects. If you were to land on an asteroid here, which are, you know, the brown rocks, you would suffer 1 face-up damage card. So that means if you happen to land right on top of it, you would take a face-up damage card. That's the only penalty. You can still make your attacks and do everything as such, but that is your first penalty. If you were to land on a debris field here, which are the, I guess you could say, blue or gray, just kind of field of debris, you will take 2 damage on any one hull zone of your choice. So you would decide from there, okay, I'm going to take 2 damage on my front arc, or however you want to distribute the damage is up to you. However, you're only distributing it amongst 1 hull zone, not multiple. However, the last obstacle here is actually a healing station. And if you land on a healing station, you're allowed to discard one of your face up or face down damage cards. So that's pretty handy and might be a point of contention between you and your opponent, since you're both trying to go for the healing station, possibly. So once all of the ships have activated, attacked, and performed their movement, it is then the squadron phase of the round. So during the squadron phase, again, starting with the first player, they'll be able to activate 1 squadron and then a second squadron if able. So each time you're trying to activate 2 squadrons at maximum, if possible. If you only have 1 squadron left, then you can only activate 1 squadron. But the order in which you activate them is completely up to you. So you'd simply pick a squadron, look at their squadron card, and determine what their speed is. Their speed is the yellow icon right there. So an A-wing here has a speed of 5, meaning that they can go from the base of this ruler all the way to the very top of it. So I would simply line this up from the base and be able to place it anywhere I'd like. So I could say, alright, this A-wing, I'm going to put him right here within his movement range. And then once I finish activating the squadron, I will simply click the little slider here so that the other color is showing. They have two colors on them, blue and red. The reason being is the initiative token that we started off with shows us which squadrons need to be activated. So this one here is telling us that all the blue squadrons need to be activated. And at the very beginning of the game, we'd set them all to the blue slider. So because I've now switched this to red, I know I've already activated this squadron for this round. So I've activated him, and then I'd pick another squadron. I'd want to pick this X-Wing here in the back, and I'd move him forward like that. And then you'd go back and forth between you and your opponent, moving all the squadrons. So, important rules to note with squadrons. Squadrons during the squadron phase can only move or attack during the squadron phase. So remember, during the ship phase, you could reveal a squadron command, which would then activate a squadron during the ship phase where they could move and attack. But if you don't do that, then during the squadron phase you can only move or attack. And also, a very important mechanic that comes to squadrons is called engagement. So if I were to move this TIE Interceptor squad all the way over here, these two squadrons would be engaged. Engagement refers to when a squadron is within range 1 of another squadron. So during the ship phase, we were using this green side of the range ruler here. But the other side refers to squadrons almost exclusively. Almost. There are times in which you have to use this side of the range ruler for ship purposes, but not often. And as you can see here on the range ruler, there's only colored icons for range 1, not range 2, 3, 4, 5, meaning that squadrons really are only effective at range 1, which happens to be their engagement range. So when a squadron is engaged with another squadron, in subsequent turns, you are not allowed to disengage from this squadron. So let's pretend we'd finished our squadron round or our squadron phase, and now it's the next round. And we've finished our ships again, and now it's the squadron phase again. So, again, starting with the first player, they would decide, alright, I want to do something with this A-Wing squadron over here. But they are engaged with this TIE Fighter squadron, which means they can't move to a different location. They have to remain right there. And they can't, so it means if they wanted to attack, they would have to attack the squadrons that they're engaged with until all the squadrons were defeated, and then they'd be allowed to move. This might be an effective strategy for tying up bomber units so that they don't reach your ships. You could send smaller squadrons to go intercept them so that when it's time for them to move or attack, they can't move any closer, or they can't attack your ships. So let's say these X-Wings were over here, but because they are engaged with these TIE Interceptors, during the squadron phase, they are not allowed to attack the ship, even though they'd really love to. Because they are engaged, they have to instead attack this TIE Interceptor squad here. And they can't even move out of the way because they're engaged. Now there are ships that have rules that change up how engagement works and so on and so forth, but these are the basics of how squadrons work. Squadrons have an anti-squadron value, which is the bluer icon here, and an anti-ship value, which is the red icon here. So when attacking other squadrons, you will grab from this pool, and when attacking ships, you will grab from this pool. Now remember, squadrons don't resolve or are affected by critical hits at all. So if and when, let's say, this TIE interceptor wants to attack this A-wing, my anti-squadron value is 4 blue dice. I would roll it, and this critical effect icon here does not do anything against squadrons. And because the A-wing that I'm attacking is a generic, it doesn't have defense tokens, so this accuracy is also useless, which means I've only done 2 hits to the squadron. And then they would attune their dial to show that they've been damaged for 2. And that would be that squadron's activation, and he would be done for this round. Squadrons can of course move through other ships and obstacles without problems, and also squadrons are not affected when they land on top of obstacles, unless it's the healing station. If they land on top of the healing station, they're allowed to recover 1 hull point. But if they land on any of the other ones, they are not affected. However, they can still be obstructed by obstacles and other ships, which still does the same effect of reducing their pool by 1 dice of their choice. When 2 squadrons are obstructed from one another, in this example we have the squadrons on opposite ends of a ship, even though they might be at distance 1 of one another, because they're obstructed, they're not considered engaged. However, during their attack phase, they may attack one another, or in this example, the A-wing may attack the ship or the other squadron if they'd like. However, because the attack is obstructed, they are still subject to the penalty of losing 1 dice from their pool. However, if they for some reason did not want to attack either of the ship or the squadron, because they are not engaged, they are allowed to instead move out of the way. But in this example, this A-wing wouldn't be able to do that, because even though it's not obstructed from this interceptor, or even though it is obstructed from this interceptor and therefore not engaged, it is engaged with the one behind it. So if it were to attack, it would have to attack this interceptor behind him. And that's how squadrons work. Once all the squadrons have moved, it is then the status phase. And during the status phase, lots of things happen. 1. All exhausted defense tokens will now become refreshed. And by that we mean we flip from the red side to the green side. It also means that this initiative token here will flip from its blue side to its red side, to signify during the squadron phase we know which squadrons to activate. So here we know that we have to activate all the red squadrons, and because we've been diligent enough and actively switching our squadrons here, we now have them all on the red side. So we know, alright, we have to activate the red squadrons. But the most important thing that happens is the round progresses. So of course, this being the first round, we have a round marker 1 to signify it. But at the end of the round, during the status phase, we will now increase it to round 2. This game is played over 6 rounds. So at the end of round 6, the game is over. And once the game is over, we simply tally up how many points worth of squadrons and ships we've destroyed. So ships are a lot harder to take down, obviously, but if you do happen to take down an enemy ship, that's a pretty big chunk of their fleet points. Now missions also allow you optional opportunities to gain more points to your total ending value. So that makes it vitally important to try and destroy enemy ships and squadrons and go for the objective to increase your total point value. So those are the basics on how to play Star Wars Armada. That is how you go through a single full round. After finishing one round, everything would reset and you'd play again to round 2. Again, always starting with the first player, in this case the rebels. And once of course a ship has received enough hull points or enough damage cards equal to its hull value, which is the gray value over here, this is the hull. Once it receives that many damage cards, whether it's face up or face down, that ship is destroyed. And at the very end of the game, you will count up all the points of destroyed ships. So for example, and their upgrades. So this Star Destroyer here, this Gladiator class Star Destroyer, is worth 56 points. But he's also upgraded with these 2 upgrade cards, thereby increasing his value for a total of 60 something points or 70 points. And then the victor is whoever has destroyed the most points. Now as I mentioned, missions change up the formula sometimes because they can provide an opportunity to gain more victory points. They don't change the conditions for victory, but they offer different opportunities, which might be more advantageous depending on what ship build you're running and what your opponent is running, so to speak. So the strategy changes from there. But those are the basics of Star Wars Armada. I'm very excited to try and do battle reports for this game, although still debating how to go about it. I really don't like hand cam, but I think that's probably the best way to go about it so that you guys can see everything that's on the field and in the best way possible. If you have any questions or any comments, I encourage you to put them into the comment section below, and